Side 4. Today's horoscope. Avoid anything pink today. You'll meet someone who'll help you see things in a new light. We had the house to ourselves. Marcia's mum had gone off to meet her boyfriend, and now Marcia lay across an armchair with her gangly legs dangling over one arm and her hands behind her head. How could she be so relaxed? I sat hunched on the edge of my seat, staring at the telephone. "We ring Norman," Marcia said. "We tell him something that makes him come round here. Something that'll also make him go down into the cellar. Treasure. Tell him there's something valuable down there." Marcia shook her head and gazed at the ceiling. Norman's not a pirate, he's an extraterrestrial. Suppose we let him believe we know something about him. Tell him we've got something of his in our cellar. I was edgy. We've only got one chance to get this right. He won't fall for it twice. It's got to be good. I know. We have to let him think we've got something important on him, but without telling him what. This was beginning to sound like complicated espionage stuff to me. "You're going to make the call, aren't you?" I asked. "Stop fretting and hand me the phone." Marcia took several tissues and shoved them over the mouthpiece. A moment later, she dialed and I'd turned into a nervous wreck. Yes, again, nervous wrecks are my speciality. Marcia cleared her throat. "Norman Volk?" Good grief, Marcia's voice had dropped 2 octaves. It even made me jump. It sounded as if she was talking from beyond the grave. "We know all about you. We know what you're up to, you and your family." Marcia spoke slowly and deliberately. "We have something of yours, something very important, something secret. Something you wouldn't want anyone to know about. If you want us to keep quiet, you'd better get over here fast, very fast, or we're going to the authorities, and you know what that means, Norman." Marcia spouted her address and put down the phone. She let out a long breath and collapsed back on the settee. She looked exhausted. Several minutes ticked by. I bit my lip. "Do you think he'll come?" "Definitely." Marcia jumped up again and zipped into the cellar. "I'm taking the bulb out so it's completely dark," she called back. "Okay, are we ready? Rob, you look like a ghost. You're not going to faint on me, are you?" Before I could answer, the doorbell rang. Through the frosted glass panel, we could see a dark shape looming. "It's him," said Marcia, and I was glad to see that even she looked a bit rattled. She took a deep breath and opened the door. Norman slunk in, scowling at the pair of us. "You," he sneered as soon as he clapped eyes on me. "I might have known it's the boy who's going to save the world." He turned on Marcia. "So who are you then? The deputy sheriff?" "You won't think you're so clever when you see what we've got," Marcia said quietly, and she fixed him with one of her hooded glares. "Oh yeah, don't tell me. You found one of our spaceships in your back garden." "It's something a lot better than that," said Marcia. "It's down here. If you know what's good for you and your family, you'd better take a look." She stood to one side and showed him the open cellar door. Norman frowned, paused, and stepped inside. Bang! The door slammed and I turned the key. In an instant, Norman was hammering from the inside. "Let me out, you slimy rats! Let me out of here!" We listened to him for a moment and watched the door quivering as he rained blows on the inside, but there was no way he could get out. We went back to the front room and sat down in triumph. We could still hear his shouts, but they were distant now, and after a while he stopped. "He's probably starting to change," I muttered. Marcia frowned. "We have a small problem," she began. "I wish I'd thought of it before. We can't see if Norman's changed until we open the cellar door. If we open the cellar door, he'll escape." A small problem? It seemed like a major catastrophe to me. What a situation to be in. We had to open the door to see, but we couldn't open the door or he'd escape. Marcia and I pondered our dilemma, and a depressing silence began to fill the front room. A silence was only broken by faint cries. I sat up and listened. The whimpering seemed strange, as if someone was really crying. Was Norman sobbing in the cellar? Marcia had noticed too, and we gazed at each other in puzzlement. I went to the door. The crying wasn't coming from the cellar. It was from beyond the front door. We crept across the hall. There was definitely someone or something crying outside. Marcia whispered, "I'll open the door, and you rush out and surprise them." "How about I open the door and you rush out?" I suggested. "We open the door and we both rush out," Marcia said. So we did. We dashed out and there was a baby. Norman's little sister. Petal was sitting in her pushchair and crying and waving her little fists in the air. "Her name's Petal," I groaned as Marcia pushed her inside. "What do we do?" "Why did Norman bring his little sister with him?" Marcia demanded crossly. "I don't know, ask him. Maybe he was looking after her when we rang and there was nobody at home to keep an eye on her, so he had to bring her." "Didn't you notice he had a baby with him when he arrived?" Marcia snapped. "No, did you?" We stared at each other angrily. Marcia put her hands to her head and took several deep breaths. "We'll have to take her back to their house. That's crazy. The first thing the Vaux'll do is ask us why we've got their baby, and suppose they're out. We hand her into the police then. Are you mad? They'll ask us where we got her from. They'll ask hundreds of questions. They know us already, remember? Was it a camembert or a gorgonzola? You know what they're like." Petal was still crying. "Can't you stop her making that noise?" "How am I supposed to do that? You tell me, you're the girl." Me and my big mouth. As soon as I said it, I wished the pavement would open up and swallow me whole. Marcia stopped dead. "What exactly do you mean by that, Rob? Are babies a girl thing only? I don't think so. Are boys banned from looking after babies? I don't think so. Are boys unable to look after babies? I don't think so." She glared at me. I was rapidly losing count of how many times Marcia glared at me these days. "You're in this too, Rob. We're going to have to look after this baby, and I mean we. Not me, by myself, on my own, without your help, but both of us. Got it?" She paused. Her nose wrinkled up, and she added in a slightly scared kind of voice, "They have nappies and stuff." We both glanced at Petal. Nappies were definitely not top of my list of what to do with a yelling baby. "Maybe she's hungry?" I suggested. "Maybe her nappy needs changing," muttered Marcia. "Let's try the easy end first," I said, wheeling the pushchair into the kitchen. "What do you think small space monsters eat?" Marcia shook her head. "Doesn't really matter, Rob, does it? I don't think Mum buys alien food very often. It's not the sort of thing we have much call for, really." Marcia had a point, I suppose. She opened the fridge and peered inside. "She'll have to have cheese on toast. It's the only thing I know how to cook." "Can't you stop her yelling? Pick her up or something." I stared at the screaming infant. Pick her up? Ugh. She might do something like wee on me or throw up. I've got an uncle and aunt with a little baby, and he's always doing stuff like that. I mean, he just leaks everywhere. I looked around for some kind of protection, but all I could find was a big black bin liner and some huge pink rubber kitchen gloves. I tore a hole in the bottom of the liner, and one on each side, and pulled it over my head. I stuck my hands in the gloves. Marcia fell about. "What are you doing?" I pulled the edges of the sack down around my legs and began unfastening blubber bags from the pushchair. "Listen, I'm not going to have baby sick all over my clothes, okay?" "If you say so." Marcia started cutting some slices of cheese, but she was still laughing. I could tell by the way her shoulders went up and down. I tried calming the baby. I clutched her to my shoulder and bounced her up and down. But it didn't seem to make much difference. She carried on screaming into my left ear hole until my brain began ringing. It was like having an entire ambulance station stuck inside your head. I sat her back in the pushchair and tried to entertain her by pulling stupid faces. "Look, funny face," I said. I went cross-eyed. I pulled out my ears. I made silly noises. I stuck out my tongue. That's when baby hit me. Bam! Boy, could she pack a punch. I crashed backwards and slammed against the open fridge. Half the contents came raining down on my head. Have you ever noticed what people put in their fridges? I'll tell you. Wet, cold things. Almost everything that goes into a fridge is wet or cold or both. My head was treated to a shampoo of milk, eggs, yoghurt, bacon slices, a piece of fish, fruit juice, tomatoes. Now look what you've done, cried Marcia. And you were worried about the baby being sick. Rob, the entire fridge has just thrown up over you. Look at the mess you've made. Can't you do anything helpful? There was a muffled yell from the cellar. What's going on out there? Let me out! Shut up! I shouted back. Then we realised that Baby had stopped crying. Do you know what she was doing now? Laughing. Laughing at me. You see, it's like I said, everyone does. How horrible can a baby get? First she smacks me in the face and then she laughs at me. There's no justice. I set about cleaning myself up. At least the bin liner had saved me from too much damage. Marcia finished off the cheese on toast and tried it out on Petal. Baby kept her mouth clamped shut. Marcia tried playing aeroplanes with her, making the food fly through the air. Here it comes, said Marcia, making her cheese on toast aeroplane dive out of the kitchen sky. Here it comes, and open your mouth. The mouth stayed shut, and the cheese on toast almost crash-landed on Petal's face. I thought babies had to have their food all mashed up, I said. Good idea. Marcia got out an electric mixer. She put the toast in the bowl and switched on. Bits of toast and cheese disintegrated and went flying out of the bowl and all over the kitchen. Marcia switched off and surveyed the bits of brown and yellow stuck to the walls and ceiling. Maybe not such a good idea after all, she murmured. Petal didn't seem to think it was very funny either, and started crying again. Marcia and I looked at each other. I knew what she was thinking. She knew what I was thinking. There was only one thing left to do. We would have to investigate the other end. Bathroom, said Marcia, and I agreed. Marcia grabbed Alien Monster, and up we went. At this point, I have to say I felt okay about the whole thing, because Marcia was holding the baby, and as long as I wasn't holding the baby, everything was all right. However, when we reached the bathroom, Marcia suddenly handed Baby over to me while she ran the bath, and all at once I didn't feel okay at all. Don't make the water too hot, I said. Babies are bathed in tepid water. You have to feel it with your elbow to make sure it's the right temperature. Marcia stared at me. How do you know? I smiled. It was in my medical encyclopedia, so there. You know what? Marcia was actually impressed. She shoved her elbow into the bath, ran a bit more cold water, and then began taking off Baby's clothes. Ugh. It was like unwrapping a present you really don't want. This was a double first for me. Not only had I never changed a baby's nappy, I'd never seen alien poo before. Can you hold my nose for me? Asked Marcia in disgust. So I bent down and held her nose with one hand and my nose with the other. I wonder she was crying, said Marcia, taking the nappy and sticking it into the bin. Right, you hold her steady while I wash her. It felt really weird. All that time I'd been thinking how horrible it would be. Looking after a baby and all that. But it wasn't. Please, please don't tell anyone this. But I actually enjoyed it. It felt nice, cosy, fun. Petal kicked her little legs and splashed us both. She gurgled and giggled and blew bubbles. I glanced at Marcia and noticed that her eyes had gone all soppy. She looked at me and grinned. Stop looking so soppy, Rob. She's going wrinkly round the edges, I snapped, fetching a towel. Dry her off. It was only after we'd dried Baby that we realised we didn't have a clean nappy for her. Now what do we do? I asked, and we searched around for something, anything we could use. All the bath towels were too big. We'll have to use loo roll, said Marcia, and that gave me an idea. I fished inside one of my pockets and produced a roll of bandage. How about this? It's better than nothing, but how come you've got something like this in your pocket? I always carry it, just in case. Just in case of what? I didn't dare tell Marcia how I lived in fear of cutting myself badly or breaking my arm or leg. In case I ever find a baby that needs an instant nappy, I growled, and started winding the bandage round and round Petal's bottom. Marcia lifted her up. "You'd better stop. She's beginning to look like an ancient Egyptian mummy." We took Minnie Monster downstairs and tucked her up on the sofa, where mercifully she fell asleep. With her mouth and eyes shut at the same time, she looked almost angelic. It was hard to believe that she was related to that dark and evil creature lurking in the cellar. "Do you think Norman's changed yet?" "Maybe. It probably takes a little while, like on the X-Files." I went out to the cellar door and listened. I kept expecting to hear alien noises, hisses and slurps and growls. But there was nothing. Marcia seemed on edge. "I just hope the others aren't able to track Norman and his sister to this house. They could try and get us." "We've got the baby," I pointed out, and she nodded. We stood and listened, but only silence drifted back, with just the occasional yell from Norman in the cellar. My eyelids drooped. I was worn out. Then we heard a key in the front door. It swung open, and in walked Marcia's mother. We dashed into the hall. "Oh, hello, Robert, you're here." Mrs. Zulinski gave me a second glance. "Look in a bit of a mess. Everything all right?" "Fine," I said. "It's just that you seem to have something stuck in your hair." She looked more closely. "A slice of tomato. How did that get there?" Marcia and I suddenly remembered the kitchen. It still looked as if an elephant had had a birthday party in there. We had to keep Marcia's mum out of the kitchen. And the front room. I panicked. I tried desperately to think of some explanation, but Mrs. Zulinski cut in on me. "Would anyone like a drink?" "No," Marcia and I chorused, and Marcia leapt towards the door. "You can't be thirsty already, Mum," she said. Mrs. Zulinski looked at both of us in turn. "Is there something going on here? Anything I should know about?" Marcia decided to tell the truth. Not all of it, but just a little bit. "I made a bit of a mess in the kitchen, and we haven't cleaned up yet. Sorry, Mum." "We all make mistakes, at least you told me. Come on, I'll give you a hand." "I don't think you—" Marcia broke off. It was too late. Her mother was already in the kitchen. Mrs. Zulinski gazed at the walls and ceiling. She studied the floor in front of the fridge. "You did say a bit of a mess." "A lot of a mess," Marcia corrected herself. "Why is there a pushchair here? Oh no, we'd forgotten the pushchair. What a giveaway." "It's mine," I squeaked, and I was thinking, nightmares are nothing to what I'm going through right now. Marcia's mum stood there, waiting for me to explain why I went around with a pushchair, and of course I couldn't think of any possible reason on earth why I should. My mouth opened and shut, but no noise, no explanation came out. Marcia wasn't any help either. She just stood there with a silly expression on her face. A loud wail came from the front room. What was that? It sounded just like a baby. True to form, Petal began giving her lungs a good workout yet again. Mrs. Zulinski went straight to the front room. "Poor little thing!" she cried, falling to her knees and gathering the infant to her chest. "What in heaven's name is a baby doing here?" It was at this point that Marcia's brain finally seemed to wear out completely, and she lost all sense of reason. "It's Rob's," she said. "Rob has a baby? He's only 11. No, protested Marcia, going incredibly red. "I don't mean that." "Well, what do you mean?" I took a deep breath. "Can we sit down, Mrs. Zulinski? I can explain everything." Then Norman began hammering on the cellar door and yelling, and I could feel the entire world come crashing down around me in a million billion fragments. Mrs. Zulinski strode out to the hall and struggled with the cellar door key. "Don't open that door!" I yelled. "There's an alien in there!" "Don't be so stupid!" "There is! You've got to believe us! We've got Norman Vork in there! He's turning into an alien! He's yellow, and he's got poisonous tentacles, and—" Mrs. Zulinski at last yanked the door open, and Norman came staggering out, blinking in the bright light of day. He wasn't yellow, and he didn't have tentacles, but he was angry. Well, maybe angry is the wrong word here. Imagine several hand grenades going off inside a drain pipe, or a nuclear explosion in the comfort of your own front room. Either of those will do. He was spitting mad. It took Mrs. Zulinski a good 10 minutes to calm him down, not to mention preventing him from seizing Marcia and myself by the throat. As soon as Marcia's mum had got Norman under control, she went mad. Everything had finally got too much for her. "I've had enough of this alien nonsense," she snapped, and she began strapping Petal into the pushchair. "We are going straight to Mr. and Mrs. Vaughan, and you can explain everything to them. I don't want to hear your silly stories any longer, Marcia, and you're just as bad, Robert. Come on!" And we set off down the street. Norman pushed Petal, Marcia and I trailed along behind, while he kept turning round and smirking. As for Mrs. Zulinski, she was still fuming away nicely behind us. I couldn't believe it. We were being frog-marched slap-bang into the arms of the enemy. Mrs. Zulinski banged on the Vaux's front door, while we waited beside her. From inside the house, we could hear noises, as something approached. We were knocking at the door, and death was about to open it. Death came in the shape of Mr. Vaughan, his eyes fixed on Norman and the baby. "Where have you two been?" he scowled. "Your mother's been looking everywhere. We told you not to leave the house." "I'm afraid that these two have got something to do with that, Mr. Vaughan. Do you mind if we come in? They've got a bit of explaining to do, and something they want to tell you." Without waiting to be asked, Marcia's mum pushed past him into the little hall, and the rest of us followed. "They shut me in the cellar, Dad," snarled Norman. "I couldn't get out." "You what?" "Who's that?" cried Mrs. Vaughan, hurrying through from the back of the house. "There you are. Where have you been?" "In a cellar," growled Mr. Vaughan. "In a cellar?" Mrs. Vaughan seemed mystified. "They think your son's an alien from outer space," sighed Mrs. Zulinski. "An alien?" Mrs. Vaughan seemed even more mystified. "Is it his ears?" "An alien?" growled Mr. Vaughan. His thick eyebrows had knitted together over his eyes like mating caterpillars. "I think we'd all better sit down while Marcia explains," suggested Mrs. Zulinski. "Why me?" Her mother pushed us through into the Vaux's front room. "Just get on with it," said Mrs. Zulinski, and then caught her breath. "My goodness, what a lot of computers and TVs and music systems. Are those mixing decks?" "I'm in the business," said Mr. Vaughan, and his hairy caterpillars started crawling down the top of his nose. "He does repairs, you know." Mrs. Vaughan's voice trailed away. Mrs. Zulinski was staring at the electronic mountain. Of course, it was no surprise to Marcia and myself. We'd seen it all before. The only difference was that in broad daylight it did look rather more ordinary, apart from the fact that there was so much of it. Marcia seemed very taken with one particular television. From the doorway, Mr. Vaughan watched everyone carefully. His eyes had gone into darting mode. Marcia straightened up. "This television comes from our school. It's got our school name written on the side in indelible ink. That's so that nobody could steal it." She gazed steadily at Mr. Vaughan. "But somebody did steal it a few days ago, and now it's here." The silence this announcement produced fell into the room like a boulder dropped from outer space. Well, a silent boulder. It was stunning. The only noise was the sound of my brain whirring inside my head as things began to make a new kind of sense to me. Mr. Vaughan's big body was blocking the door. He scowled back at Marcia and Mrs. Zulinski. Mrs. Vaughan began to whimper in the corner. "The girl knows," she whispered desperately. "I knew this would happen. It always does. You and Norman, you can't stop." "Shut up!" Mrs. Zulinski's eyes widened. "Then all this equipment here, it's all stolen." Still, Mr. Vaughan didn't answer, and Marcia's mother moved towards the door. "I'm going to call the police." Mr. Vaughan blocked her way. "You're not going anywhere." "I beg your pardon?" "Shut up and sit down." "What are we going to do?" whined Mrs. Vaughan. "We'll have to move on," snapped her husband, "like we did last time. But first of all, we shall have to fix this lot." "I've had enough of this," cried Marcia's mum. "Let us through." She tried to get past, but Mr. Vork gave her such a shove that she stumbled back across the room and collapsed into an armchair. Marcia launched herself at Mr. Vork, which would have been brave and wonderful if she hadn't done her usual party piece and tripped over her own gangly legs. She fell at his feet and ended up beating her fist on his knees rather than his chest. "Don't you dare touch my mother!" Mr. Vork laughed. It was horrible. It was the laugh of the Killer King from Prague. He was a very scary person, giving off incredibly menacing vibes. I could almost see them shimmering round his hulk, like in some horror movie. His eyes looked as if 1,000,000 volts of electricity were charging through them. This wasn't like Norman's little red doot-doot-doot-doots. This was mega phaser stuff. I thought he was going to turn into an alien right there on the front room carpet. Except, of course, he wasn't an alien, as we now knew to our cost. I have to admit I was impressed by Marcia's attack on Mr. Vork. It was pretty brave. "You can't keep us prisoners forever," I said, "just because we know you've been thieving all over the place. How long are you going to hold us here?" "Shut it! I've had it up to here with you lot. Norman, you start taking the stuff out to the truck. It's round the back. Anyone makes a wrong move, and that's it. You lot know too much for your own good." "What are you going to do with us?" asked Mrs. Zulinski in a tired voice. Mr. Vork curled his lip. "I'll think of something." Norman and his mother began carting TVs and computers out through the back of the house while Mr. Vork watched over us. At one point he told Norman to fetch the stuff from upstairs, and several minutes later Norman came clumping back down, struggling under the weight of, guess what? An alien. There it was. And I mean, there it was, in Norman's scraggy arms. 3 legs, tentacles, poisonous frills, the whole lot. You know what it was? A giant pot plant. It was some kind of big frilly green thing stuck in a pointed pot that rested on a metal stand with 3 legs. I think that was the lowest point I'd ever reached in my life. I just wanted to hide for 100 years. Marcia and I glanced at each other and then quickly turned away. I don't know which of us felt the more embarrassed. Silence descended. It was like waiting for the end of the day at school. You know how it almost gets to home time, and then the classroom clock seems to stop altogether. Time doesn't move forward at all, and you're waiting and waiting. And then the window burst into 1,000,000 fragments of glass, and a man came hurtling through and landed on the carpet. "Everyone freeze!" he yelled. And about time, too. I'd been waiting for this moment ever since I'd contacted the police on the phone. Ha! And all along you've been thinking what a wally I am. I'd managed to unhook the Vork's phone and pressed 999 while Marcia was making a lunge for Norman's dad, and all eyes were on her. I knew I wouldn't actually be able to speak to the police without Mr. Vork hearing, but I reckoned that if I could keep the channel open, then they would hear the conversation, work out what was happening, and trace the call. And that's almost it. Mr. Vork was overpowered. Waiting outside the house were 6 police cars and most of the neighbours, all agog with excitement. The police swarmed over the house, and they found stolen goods in almost every room. There were 3 more potted aliens upstairs and loads of other plants. Mr. Vork had been doing over garden centres too. Apparently the plants were worth hundreds. The police had been after Vork for months. When he was finally marched out of the house to a waiting police van, Mrs. Parslow almost went berserk. She tried to kick his shins as he went past. "That's the one that attacked me yesterday. He put a blanket over me, you horrible man!" "Everyone's mad round here," muttered Mr. Vork, shaking his head. Then he vanished into the van, closely followed by his son. Norman had made everything up about being an alien and the photonic shield and all that. He had simply used my own fears to protect his dad. They were in it together, and Marcia and I had caught them. It was almost like the famous 5, except there were only 2 of us and we didn't have a dog, so it was even better. Strange thing, when everyone at school heard about it, they stopped calling Marcia Bogbrush. As for me, I still worry and I still play the violin, and I'm getting much better at both. My pockets are still full of bandages. I mean, you never know when you might need an emergency nappy. They haven't stopped calling me Chicken Lickin' at school, but it's like a friendly joke now. They know I'm a worrier, and they also know I caught the Vaux. Even Kevin Durbell was impressed. Anyhow, I like worrying. I had some spots come up this morning, red ones with a tiny yellow dot in the centre. I've looked them up in my encyclopedia, and I reckon it's the first stage of Frobisher's scrofula. All your skin flakes off, and your bones fall apart. It's fatal, of course. Marcia says she'll look after me. She reckons that we're all aliens, all of us. You, me, her, everyone. How do you work that out, I asked. I just mean that we all seem strange to everyone except ourselves. You don't think you're peculiar, but lots of other people do. It's the same with me and just about everyone. It's like we're aliens to each other. I screwed up my nose. You're weird, I said. Marcia's face broke into a huge smile and she chuckled. Exactly. Oh, yes, you remember that sign Mr. and Mrs. Vaux had on their throats? I saw it again a few days later on my computer screen. I was looking at Mystic Myrtle the Cosmic Turtle, and she was doing next month's birthday sign. It was Gemini, the twins. The star pattern was identical. I knew I'd seen it somewhere before. I suppose Mr. and Mrs. Vaux had each had the tattoo done in their lovey-dovey days. Not even Marcia had got that one. And there's one other thing. If that wasn't a UFO over the Vaux house that night, then what was it? This audiobook was produced and published by Penguin Books Limited.